today on the training, um, we're going to focus on a couple of things. I'm going to spend a few minutes uh, for the training just talking about some of the recent sort of learning experiences we had on these deals, um, and just what we need to keep learning and focusing on and refining and honing in so we can be better. And then what we'll do today is we'll go through the construction checklist, um, because that's obviously really important to understand. How do we navigate construction projects when they come in on the phase two for the loan processor side? What are some of the specific things that we need to be aware of? So that's what we'll do today for the training. To start off, we had obviously on the most recent transaction that we'll name nameless, but the the key on that one, which pulled the plug very, very last minute after we got all the approvals. One of the things that I think the takeaway of that is that you had multiple partners involved in that. And I think the reason that blew up, and Tom, feel free to chime in if I'm wrong on this, but because the partners didn't want to sign on the loan. Is that correct? Tommy, there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I realized I hit the mute on my headphone. Yeah, so I think, yeah, it was out of the main partner leading the show, had a I guess a life event that kind of scared the other partners that, if something was to happen to the main guy leading the show, they're kind of left holding the bag.
Yeah.
It is kind of what really triggered it, is what they were telling us.
Yeah. And, even though we're still going to get compensated on it, I still consider it a learning lesson, because this is why it's so important. And Lana, this is important for you to know on the loan processor side. The reason why we have all these sort of checklists in place is to help mitigate some of these issues. One of the major issues for multiple partners is making sure that they're part of the kickoff call, because we address so many things on that kickoff call that, as much as even the partner's like, no, it's fine, it just needs to be me or whatever, that's not acceptable. We literally cannot proceed unless we have all the parties on the phone. And you're seeing the end result of that. If they're not on there, then all of a sudden you go through this whole process and you realize at the end, nobody was communicating with them. Nobody was telling what's going on. And they wake up one morning and go, oh my gosh, so I have to sign personally? Well, yeah, I mean, that was the deal from day one. We could have saved ourselves a lot of headache, right, if we would have just addressed this up front. So I think no matter what, unless the manager or whoever it is says otherwise, we don't proceed on a kickoff call unless all the partners are on the phone. Period.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that we learned our lesson on that from another deal, and that's what makes this one so frustrating, is we learned our lesson on that from another deal, and even we addressed it up front on the start to say, hey, you've got multiple partners, who's calling the shots, can we get everybody involved? And we got pushback. If you remember on our initial transfer call, I remember being in your office and having the call, and it was no need to involve everybody else. They kind of just go along with what I say.
Yep.
And yeah, no, I think anytime we've got somebody who can back out with a signature, just one signature. We need to make sure that they're there, no matter what the head honcho says running the show on their side.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And so that's again a good learning lesson for us to be super diligent on this particular item, but just on everything else. You know, for a lot of people, they're going to go, "Yeah, it's not a big deal. I don't see the big," you know, and we know better that the whole reason why all these steps are in place because we've seen so many issues. And so it's, you know, important to use that as a candid but gracious reminder to them, hey, we've seen stuff happen before. It's kind of like when I climbed Mount Rainier years ago, and you know, we were just sort of having a chat in the back, and the guy turned around and yelled at us, and I was like, man, what's the big deal? And he said, well, I saw someone die right there 2 weeks ago from rockfall. So,
Oh, wow.
you know, keep your mouth shut, right? So, oh, okay. So, you know, I mean, in a similar way, we're the ones running the ship and needing to say, here's sort of how this, you know, needs to work. So, you know, and it's to their benefit. We always have to remember that too. Sometimes we're like, oh, I don't want to be offensive, or I don't, it's sort of like with a child, you're doing it for their benefit. They don't know what they don't know. And so we just have to remember all this stuff is for their benefit. And so that's just a helpful way for you to present it to them in such a way that, you know, it's not combative, but it's like, hey, we're trying to do what's best for you. And all these steps are for your benefit. And that's just another sort of tactical way for you to be candid but gracious, probably more on the gracious side. So that's the first one. The second learning lesson was my failure, absolutely, which was when we did the transition call. We let it slip that the purchase contract was not executed by both parties. And so what ended up happening is we went all the way down the road, got to underwriting, submitted to underwriting, and you know, guess what happened? They bailed out of the contract because the seller didn't want to do it anymore. Well, unfortunately, there's no repercussions because you don't have a signed contract. If there would have been a signed contract, we could have, you know, buyer could have said, well, you know, I'm sorry, but you decided to sell, you're stuck, right? Or something there too. But there was no recourse. So it's a good reminder as well to myself and to everybody else, obviously, but is, you know, that's why we have that in place. We don't have a signed purchase contract. We don't have a deal. So nothing can be transitioned from phase one to phase two unless there is unless we have a signed contract, if it's a purchase contract. So that's really important to remember as well. So are there any questions on those two? But I think it's just important to keep remembering, you know, these steps are there for the benefit of the client and for the benefit of us too, to make sure that, you know, we're staying focused and disciplined, et cetera, et cetera. So any comments or questions on that before we dive into the main training today?
The only comment I have is it was a big lesson for me as well. Because as I mentioned to you, Dave, Sean was so responsive. And I didn't mean to say his name, but and he kept telling me he's working on it. And I kind of went with that when I should have just, you know, put a halt to things. But yeah, it was a big lesson for me. my first big lesson.
Well, that's a good lesson to notate too, Lana, is, these are things that, will become intuitive as well, which is if somebody, you're going to see these trends. Tom saw this recently on a transaction that didn't go together, which is when a borrower starts to go dark and the communication breaks down, something's going on 9 times out of 10, right? If the communication breaks down, if there's a break in the pattern of regular communication, you can be rest assured something's going on. Could be they're having a health issue, could be that they're changing their mind, but it's a good pause time to say, okay, time out, and it's a communication piece where you externally let the party who's not communicating know, hey, I just want you to know we're sort of on pause until we talk, right? We're not
Mhm.
doing anything until we communicate. Because again,
Mhm.
we need full cooperation from all parties, and sometimes that's a tactical way that you can use, sort of like Tom's learned that if you're trying to get somebody to feel comfortable and move forward on things, a tactical way is to bring in another lender so that you can, help them feel comfortable. Getting everybody on a phone call is a way tactically to get things moving. And this is another way to hit the pause button, externally communicate, hey, everything's completely on pause at this point till I hear from you, right? And all parties need to know that, because if there's someone on the other side of the coin going, well, wait a minute, then that's just going to put more pressure on the person to fess up or, get going again. So, or we may find out that something happened. So either way, we don't want to be accusatory, but part of our job is we have to keep the ball rolling. And whenever that's why we're always urgent and that things are going, Lana, that's why we have this whole thing of, walking through the system, making sure that there's a particular cadence, making sure that we're following up and following through, and that you have all these specific ways to, take the steps, assure the documents tied to it, by reiterating, agreeing to commitment to timelines, and then following up and following through. And the reason why is because, as you'll see, that, time kills deals and things can go haywire. So, okay, so let's dive into the construction checklist. I suppose I need to give you permission there, Tom, so go ahead.
Yeah.
We want to pull that up and begin the process of the construction checklist. So take
Yeah.
the floor.
So, okay, so this is the construction checklist tab on the Phase 2 master checklist. So we don't do a whole lot of construction loans, but there's just another element that kind of gets added to these that we need to make sure that we're keeping on top of the borrower and that the information they're providing is the information and the numbers are giving. So that's really where this thing falls into place. When we get when we have a construction loan, the things that are added to it are really going to be a budget for the construction, where the money is going to complete the job. And then there's going to be additional contracts required for, GCs, architects, and then basically permits, from the city, the okay to move ahead with the project. So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we've got the budgets on the top part here. We're just going to notate the total amount of the budget, and that budget is going to be broken down into 2 main sections, one being hard costs and one being soft cost. So we want to keep the total budget, just number amount, dollar amount up there, and then there'll be a section that's hard cost. Hard cost is basically anything that I normally think about is that's not bolted down. Anything that, or anything that's bolted down, it's not going in there. It's the brick and mortar building. It's anything that cannot be removed, essentially. It's going to cover the main construction of the building, and then the soft costs are the anything that can be removed from the building or anything that's not really an actual tangible item. Some soft costs will include, from what I've seen on some deals, sometimes it'll include like developer fees I've seen in there.
Architecture, it's architecture, engineering,
Yeah, architect. Yeah,
planning, permits, things that are just non-tangible, legal, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah. There you go. So best example on something like this is, if we were having a client, helping a client build a restaurant, the hard cost would be the brick and mortar building, so the windows, the drive-through, the assembly for the drive-through, all that sort of stuff. The soft costs would be the booths inside, the equipment inside, as far as the cooking equipment, the soda machines, the signage outside of the building, and any sort of point of sales equipment would be under soft cost. Then obviously the other, permit fees, development fees, things like that, money that's just paid to vendors. So keep, and that's to keep those two amounts separate, because they do play a factor into the loan and how the lender looks at the amounts being financed. Typically when there's a construction going on, there might be different breakdowns to the financing as far as amortization. The hard costs might be amortized. It might be one loan, but we've got two separate terms that in a sense get blended together. So we might have hard costs are amortized over 25 years, and then soft costs, the funds that go to soft costs, might be amortized depending on if the life expectancy of or the usable life of the soft cost items, like the furniture. They might amortize it only over like 10 years or 15 years, something like that. So that's why it's important to know, if we've got a loan amount and they change the budget, we need to know, well, did the hard costs go up? Did the soft costs go up? What changed?
Yeah, let me just clarify that, Tom, too, just probably a minor correction on that, is that,
okay.
You're correct that there could be a separate amortizing component, but the soft costs are going to be different than like furniture. So that's going to be a separate item, which would be FF&E. So furniture, fixtures, and equipment is going to be you're correct in the sense that would be more than likely dealt with differently in either an amortization or how much they'll actually finance, or both. So that's probably just a good thing to have as a separate line item, is if there's any FF&E, so furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Because the equipment really is the thing that technically could be
amortized differently.
Correct. Yeah, that could, like on a car wash, that could easily, especially now, that could be something that's separate and amortized over a shorter period of time, for sure. So I would say let's have a separate line item for that, and just so that it's so that it becomes something at least addressing it. Because like on a hotel, that is definitely the case where you have a lot of FF&E in the
Okay.
for sure.
Okay. I've been lumping that in on the soft costs on the past deals, but if we should keep it separate, then I'll break it out.
I think so. It might be the case where it's fine, but a lot of times with the soft costs, just one other notation is on the soft costs, it's important to realize that sometimes, depends on the lender, there may be some soft costs that they just won't finance at all.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's like certain types of legal, or if it wasn't affiliated directly with the project, I know sometimes the SBA can get kind of finicky. So those are just important, as you mentioned, Tom, to delineate, because the lender might say, hey, we don't finance these types of soft costs. So
Okay, I'll keep it broken out on here for FF&E for furniture, fixtures, and equipment on a separate line.
would you also say, Tom, that soft costs are going to be interest carry? Like if that falls under interest carry, that's another thing too.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry, like an interest reserve or.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And like things like that, those won't get caught. Like, well, SBA won't finance a lot of that stuff, or yeah, they won't do like the interest reserves or anything like that.
I think that's really important for the loan processor to know that up front, that to make sure you address that, the interest carry. So I don't know if you want to have that.
We do address that on the lender side. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, then I'm jumping ahead. So go ahead.
Yeah. You're right at the end. That
finished.
We're finished. We're done.
Oh, we're done. Okay.
So okay, so yeah, we can break this budget down a bit more. My main focus on this was making sure that the numbers we're talking about, and then capturing the budget date. And for that, in some cases it's a cut and dry. The client starts with a budget and they finish with that same budget. That's not always the case. We've worked with clients that have multiple budget revisions, and it's very critical to make sure that before you even start talking about the budget, to just ask the question, what's the date of your budget? Because one day can make a difference. So if there's if you're talking budget with the client and something's not jiving, just immediately go for the budget date. Make sure that you're on the same budget. If not, get the updated budget from them. So that's,
is there a requirement for a date that's like, does it have to be within 30 days? Is there some requirement for that?
Not really. Obviously, if the longer the budget sits there, the cost of construction is going to change over time.
Right.
So, as long as, if something's aging too long, it's good to just go back and revisit the numbers and make sure the cost of construction or cost of equipment hasn't gone up. Sometimes, they'll get quotes on equipment, or on, if they've already got a quote on construction and that construction quote's not going anywhere, it might be the construction quote's good for X number of days, which, they might be running their budget off of that. Just make sure that things haven't, gone stale in that regards. But yeah, it's not really necessary that, the budget has to be, updated every X number of days, or the lender wants to see it dated within a certain time frame. Just, kind of whatever, going off of what's reasonable, for the current, change in what's going on with the construction costs and whatnot.
Yeah, but I think it's a good point, Lana, that we're in a market right now, and every market's going to change, but we are in a market where prices are just continuing to go up. Mm-hmm. I think it is important to understand what type of agreement they have with the contractor. Like, for example, if they say, hey, this is just kind of a, it's a rough bid, from the contractor, that's really important to know, versus somebody that said, I have a fixed price hard contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
because, or a cost plus or whatever that is, because if it's a fixed price contract, then what the contractor's saying, we are guaranteeing that this is the final price. Versus most of them are not that. They're usually a cost plus, and maybe there's some, general cushion there. But the reason why that's important is because you could get to the end of the project and prices have, just skyrocketed. So I think that is definitely important to address that up front to make sure that there's enough cushion. That's usually why they have the interest reserve in there, or the contingency. But
Contingency, yeah.
definitely. So it's a good point for sure.
So yeah, so make sure you're talking about the same budget date. Yeah, it's good to make sure that it's within a reasonable time frame. That's going to depend on, what, as Dave was saying, kind of what's agreed on, the current vendors, invoices, things like that, or bids and whatnot. Next thing is permits. Now, permits, city, municipality, whatever, governing, board is there. We just need to make sure that the borrower has obtained the necessary permits or is aware of the necessary permits, or how are they getting them. In some cases it's we've had situations where it's the borrower is requesting the permits. I've seen it where they go through a third party to do their permitting, but we need to make sure that they are working on it and that they have an ETA on it. I think I've only ever seen one deal where they allowed them to go ahead and kind of move ahead with the loan process without the permits. But really, if there's no permit, there's no construction. So it's something
That's
that really
something that we require copies of, like the permit.
the lender will want it, yeah. So
Okay.
we'll need to get it to the lender, and it might not be something that's handed over until towards the tail end of the process. We just need to we need to make sure that it's being worked on, and that it's happening.
I thought permits, you needed permits before you even start anything, but that's not the case.
Before they start construction, definitely.
Yeah.
And that's why the lender will want it before closing. And like I said, I've only ever seen, I think, one example, and I can't remember which loan it was even, but I remember that they were okay with getting the permits after the fact, which was a little unique. But I guess they're, unless they have the permits, they're not starting the construction and they're not spending money. So it's not, it's not really drawing on the loan until they have the permits.
Right.
But they'll, make sure that the borrower is working on it, and then, obviously make sure the lender requirements are, laid out as to when those need to be provided, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's probably just important definitionally to understand, like, what is a permit. So we all understand, like, when we're talking about permits, we're talking about somebody going into the city and pulling a permit, which is really the Willy Wonka ticket, so to speak, for them to start the project. They can't do anything unless they have permits.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes there's delineation there. It could be a grading permit just to do grading versus an actual building permit. So just definitionally something we understand.
And then next section, plans. Need to make sure that we've got the plans, and normally they can't pull the permits without the plans for the most part. So plans should come first, but we need to make sure, where are they on the plans, what's the ETA. Every client's going to be a bit different in how they approach this sort of stuff. Some are going to want to have everything settled as far as plans, permits, ready to go, then find financing. Some clients are going to want to know, can they get financing, before they've even really gotten too much expense on the project. So make sure that, the client has the plans, those are complete. If not, how far away are they from having those complete? Because, that's the plans are something that's really going to drive the GC contract, the budget itself, getting the permits, all that good stuff.
Mhm.
So just making sure they have final plans and what the timeline is. It's also going to affect the appraisal. We need to be able to show the appraiser what he's going to be trying to evaluate, and for the once complete, once stabilized value. If there's no plans, there's nothing for him to really gauge a value on. Anything you want to add on that, Dave?
Just for plans.
Mhm.
No, I think, plans are obviously just another element for somebody to, make sure that they're, along the pathway for a full success. Is to understand there's drawings that have taken place, and lenders like to see those. So no, I don't think there's anything to add other than we obviously need to get a copy of those if we can. So
Okay. GC contract. This is each deal is going to be a little bit different as far as the GC goes. For the most part, they just need one bid from a GC and a signed GC contract. In some cases, depending on how it's being completed, the lender might require multiple bids just to make sure that the GC is giving a fair and honest bid. But basically, we want to know that the borrower. Now, there's a second component to this that we'll go over in the bottom section under lender requirements. We want to know that the borrower has a GC selected and they're starting down that path, because GC selection can take some time. So we want to know that they're working with somebody. That's also another piece to that is the GC is going to give the little section below here. The GC cost estimate should be part of the GC contract. That's going to make sure that their budget's in line. That what's the hard cost in their budget is something that's reasonable. So if we want to make sure that they have a GC selected, that they're working with somebody. If they've got a contract, that's great. If they just have like a rough draft or a draft of it, that at least we've got something where we can review it. And it should have a estimate on the cost, just to make sure that everything's in line with the budget.
yeah, I think, and it's really important to recognize that there's going to come a point within the transaction where you definitely have to have a contract in place.
That was going to be my next question. It's like, at what point do we, in the process,
It's a little tricky to be too black and white on it, but I will say that it's definitely before, certainly before closing for sure. Not pretty close to a commitment time, because if you don't have a contract in place, you're sort of stuck.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of lenders they want to know that you are committed to somebody, and the reason why is because that sort of goes back to the budget.
Mm-hmm.
If they now have something in writing and it's signed, then they've committed to this budget. So
Right.
I think that should be a heavy emphasis on the processor's part to really get a clear picture. When are you going to get a GC contract signed? Kind of goes back to the purchase contract in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I
You,
was thinking.
there's not every time you get a document that has signatures in it, you're just creating more commitment. The less documents with no signatures, then there's just more opportunities for somebody to bail out or not commit to something. So I think we definitely want to lean in on that one, as much as we can.
Yeah, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the lender requirement section. But yeah, it's definitely a critical piece to the puzzle. But it kind of has two facets to it, where we need the borrower on board with getting a GC selected, but we also have to get the lender to review it too. But then the last piece here for the construction items that we normally track is the architect contract. which that should really be coming over with the plans. And maybe I should kind of rearrange these. I just kind of put contracts at the bottom. But basically, yeah, an architect contract too, because that's, they need to have something in writing. The architect contract should really be done before it makes it to us. But if there's no architect contract, there's no plans, we're a ways off from getting this thing completed, because they can't even really go to a GC without having an architect draw up the plans. In some cases, also the GC and the architect will act, and be the same. I've seen that on some of our deals where it's the same group. But just, yeah, good to make sure we've got an architect contract, plans, and then move it to GC contract for the borrower side. So then our lender requirements. Lenders are going to have their own specific requirements on what the borrower is doing as far as the budget, the GC, the plans or the contract with the GC and all that good stuff. So on the budget side, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're reviewing is allowable contingent percentage. So the contingent is, normally there's a hard cost contingency and a soft cost contingency. And what that is it's normally, on average, and most lenders allow it to go up to about 10% of the budget, and it's wiggle room for the budget. So if, they plan for, the hard costs to be, $1 million, but it turns out that it's $1,500,000, something like that, 1,500,000, that will, 1,500,000, just to cover their bases. They don't have to come out at the end of the construction 5,000 out of pocket. They've got this contingency budget that they can pull from, and that gets allocated to, it's additional funds that they have access to that's not really earmarked for a specific use in the budget. Some lenders will allow 10%. Some lenders will lower that amount to 8%, but there always should be a contingency percentage in there. If not, it's something where we need to go. We should really be going back to the client. I mean, if we've got a client that's coming to us with no contingency budget, it might be that they're kind of new at this, but there should be a contingency in there for change in surprise, and if they're starting to do that foundation and they find that there's a big boulder in the way they have to move, or halfway through the process they find that the cost of materials gone up 2-3%, could really throw things off if they don't have that backup contingency. It's also something that we check with the lender during our off call. We talked to them about the contingency budget. It's in there. What happens to that contingency? Say they set their budget of $1 million, with a 10% contingency on top of it, but they hit $1 million and they don't need anything. What happens to that contingency? Some lenders will allow it to be used as working capital. Some lenders, don't want it touched at all if it's not used for the construction. That's something that we need to make sure that we're aware of. The other thing that kind of plays as a contingency is, and the next section here is line item reallocation. One of the clients we did quite a few constructions with, they were really good with their budgets, and they knew that they could kind of pad their each line item. If they had a budget for equipment and they knew that the equipment was spot on going to be $10,000, they'd put it as 11,000, because it would kind of give them a little bonus contingency. But we need to make sure that the lenders allow that if one bucket isn't used for a certain line item on a budget, can we move it from equipment to furniture, or can we move it from equipment to signage or something like that? So it's kind of a little bonus contingency that we can sometimes work out for a client, if it's worked into the budget that way.
And some lenders some lenders are loose with this, and some lenders are finicky with it.
Mhm.
And so I think that's an important discussion to have with the lender to ask them how they handle that, right? I mean, it's
Mhm.
a good dialogue, because what you don't want to have is that you get into the construction and they wake up and go, oh, you can't allocate, um, money into that category. And they're like, what? So that could be a problem if it's not addressed.
Yep. Yeah. So, and also with that reallocation, a lot of times it gets tied to the budget as far as hard costs can be reallocated to other hard costs, but they can't be hard costs moved to soft cost. So that's
Mm.
another reason to kind of watch your, if you've got somebody, saying, well, we've kind of padded all the numbers in the hard costs because we think that the furniture might be a little bit more, that might not be the best plan for them. So just make sure that you understand how that reallocation will work and can relay it. But I believe that's also something we address on the kickoff call. So it's just good to make sure everybody's on the same page. But we can go over it. Make sure we're keeping notes on it here, because in the future when the borrower at the end of the process brings it up and they've forgotten, that's where we keep our good notes and can direct them. So
One final thing on that too. This
Sure.
is also the same area that you might ask the question, Lana, of being proactive, of saying, well, what happens if we have excess contingency at the end?
Mhm.
Which is, does that end up being working capital for me, or do I just have to give it back, or et cetera, et cetera? So I think that would be important just to address as well.
Okay.
yeah, and that is one thing that we definitely go over on the kickoff call, just to make sure that everybody hears it, at the same time, because that can really change plans. If they're putting in their continue expecting it to be working capital and it's not going to go away, that's something they need to be aware of up front for sure. So draws. That's something that we need to be aware of, is how are the draws going to work for the construction. Is there a draw fee, and then also these two are kind of tied together with, is there a draw fee, and are the draw inspections done third party or in-house? So some lenders will send out sorry, let me backtrack a bit there. When they do the construction, they don't say you've been approved for $1 million. Here's your $1 million, get to work. What they do is they normally break up the draws depending on how long the construction is going to take. So, if it's going to take 6 months, they might do 3 draws, a draw every 2 months. They could do 6 draws, draw every month. Really depends on, normally it's a discussion. There's some leeway on the lender's side, and the client kind of has an idea of when they'd like the draw. So that's something that gets discussed on the kickoff call. But we want to make sure that we understand how the lender typically does their draws as far as timing, and then what's the process. Is it, some lenders will drive out to the site themselves and just inspect it, take a look, make sure everything's going according to plan. Some lenders will have a third-party inspector go out and look at the site. And that's going to impact fees, and also just the process in general. If there's a third party involved, there's going to be a greater fee. If there's a third party involved, it could also involve additional paperwork got to fit into the third party's box. The lender's obviously in most cases going to be a little bit more lenient on their own stuff. So just something that we want to have a discussion. What's the draw process like? What does it look like? And then the section below it, is an AIA draw form required. That's a form that's a construction form that basically gives like a breakdown of what's been spent on the project, and the lenders like to see it, or the third party like to see it. It's just a standard form that gets used. Most I've seen do require it, but it's just a note up front. I've had brought up a couple times by clients is, the AIA form going to be required. So it's just good to address. That AIA form is nothing that we have to fill out, but it's just good to make sure that clients are aware. It's something that they seem to be, very curious about. So it's just good to ask.
Yeah, and I think, on the, a lot of this is just making sure that you're walking through this yourself and then also with the client on the draws, because, it's just important for them to understand so they're not blindsided once they, start the, post funding. Sometimes people are doing this for the first time, so they don't really understand how all of this works. So I think that's just important for them to educate and say, here's how things work at this, this is how long it's going to take to turn things around, to get your draws. This is the, you can expect that when you do this, it's going to happen. We're going to have to do an inspection. So all that's just really important so that they are enlightened as to what to expect when they do this, right? So they're not sort of shell-shocked.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, some of these things, draw fees and whatnot, in some cases could be minor. If the bank's doing it, might be $100, $200. If a third party's doing it, it could, start building up where all of a sudden, it might be $1,000 for a visit and reviewing everything, where 5 visits, you're $5,000 over budget that they just didn't plan for, which could go from the contingency, but it's just good things to be aware of up front. This is the kind of the second look at the GC. This is the lender side. So just because the borrower selects a GC, it doesn't mean the lender is going to use them. The lender might have specific requirements, so we need to know what those are. Some lenders will want to see financials on the GC, a list of projects they've completed in the past, and then their upcoming workload. Some of them, depending on how strong the GC is, if they've had any sort of bumps in the road in the past, this section below can sometimes be triggered where there's a bond required, where they have to have an additional bond for the GC, and that's going to come down to the lender's approval. So typically before the deal gets looked at for an approval or goes into underwriting, we will need the GC contract, because the underwriter is going to want to review that and kind of sign off on the GC. Each lender is different. I've seen the GC get reviewed after the initial underwriting and approval on it, but it's something that the lenders won't move ahead and close it unless we have a GC selected. That's also sometimes the lenders will require multiple bids to approve a GC, so just be aware of that. Talk to the lender and find out if the borrower comes to you with a GC, are you going to accept them, or do you need 3 bids, 2 bids? What's the process on your side? And once this bond requirement is something that we really won't know until after the underwriters looked at it, but it's good to kind of just have the question, just to know, if the lender typically requires a bond, or how they go about that. And then the last section here, interest reserve. Basically, interest reserved is basically prepayment on a loan is the best way to sum it up. They're borrowing the money to pay the loan. So, if we've got a client that's building a, like, I guess best example would be a self-storage unit or self-storage property, where once it's complete, it makes no money because the unit's rented. So typically the clients or the developer will ask for interest reserves of, depending on how long it takes to ramp up that property. With self-storage, I think they shoot for 12 to 18 months. I think 24 is kind of the maximum they'll go for. But basically they will borrow the loan payments on an interest-only basis for 12, 18, 24 months so they can pay the loan back from that money. It's something that we need to make sure that the lender is on board with, and we can do with the loan type. So with SBA loans, they won't, if we do it like an SBA 504, we can't do an interest reserve in an SBA 504, but in some cases we can do a side loan like an SBA 7A to go along with it as the interest reserve. On conventional lending, I don't think there's quite as much requirements, or they'll basically allow an interest reserve on there, but the timing of it is important. If we've got interest reserves for 18 months, but the lender says, sorry, we only do 12 months interest reserves, something that we need to be aware of, and possibly go back to the drawing board on if it's not going to fit into the borrower's budget.
So the interest reserves are that there, it's a part of the loan amount that's held for the
Yeah.
12 to 18 months they can pull from until they get up to speed with having income come in. Is that correct?
Yeah, and typically the way that it works, let's just say that the interest payment's going to be $1,000 a month, just to make the math easy.
Mm-hmm.
They'll fund $12,000, but they'll put it into an account for the borrower, and basically they'll just start pulling the $1,000 a month through the construction time, and up until the property should be stabilized or the interest reserves run out. Then the borrower's kind of on their own to make payments. So normally the way that interest reserve gets calculated is through construction time and then up to the stabilization period on a property, which each property is going to be different. I mean, if you're starting up a fast food restaurant, it's not going to take a whole lot of, once the construction is completed, it doesn't take a whole lot of ramp up time compared to if you're doing a multifamily property or a self-storage property where you slowly build clients time. It depends.
How does the how does the time get, who approves that time? Who sets the
Generally speaking, Lana, what happens is the lender basically takes, well, so let's just say your budget's 10 million bucks, okay? What they'll do is since you're not drawing on the whole 10 million bucks from day one, they'll take the $10 million multiplied by 60%, because they figure you're going to average at about 60% over time. And then they multiply that by the interest rate. So let's say it's 5%. It's $300,000 for your interest reserve. So the reason why is because you're going to be zero from day one, and then your final one should be 100% draw. So they're trying to take some sort of rolling average. So they 60% to calculate that to come up with a number, generally speaking. But the person who dictates that ultimately is going to be the lender. And the lender's going to come up with their own version. But it's important to understand what that is and how they came up with it, because you want to make sure that we give enough cushion for the borrower to be successful. Because we don't want them to run out of interest reserve.
right.
So.
Okay.
And it should, the way that they normally gauge it is the borrower wants it to cover obviously construction time and then their ramp up time for the property to become profitable, however that property is set up. If it's each property is going to have its own ramp up time to start generating income.
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
Good. Well, this has again been the construction checklist for phase 2 on the loan processor side, and we we'll continue next time, but thanks everybody for coming on today.
Thank you. It was very helpful. I
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
both.
All right, bye-bye.